Okay, very good. We're recording now for for today's October 10th session, and let's go ahead and jump in and start.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully this works. All right, so one of the things that I wanted to let you know is you can always ask a question, but we also encourage you to put questions in your chat box, and Ron is going to be monitoring those. So if we see something on there, we'll try to make time when it makes sense to answer those questions as best we can. And if Ron and I don't have the answer, we'll get it for you, and we'll get that information out to you in another way. So today's topic is goal writing, progress monitoring, and instructional decision making. We're not going to go into details such as how you set ambitious good examples, bad examples, etc. So that will be the focus of today.
Angie?
Ron, did you have a question?
Yes, I don't, it's possible it was just on my end, but we lost you just briefly there. Can I see, did anybody else lose Angie's voice for a brief moment there? Nod your head if you did. And so, okay, so something happened there. We're going to cross our fingers that it won't happen again, but
okay. I did see that my connection was unstable for just a second, and so I'll try to keep cognizant of that as well.
Thanks.
All right, good. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so again, make sure you sign in on the attendance page, and you do have this PowerPoint available on that participant page as well. So again, we've kind of talked about the content for today's session, how to write a baseline, the goal, the progress monitoring statements. One of the things that I find when I review IEPs, and I have to review all of the regional administrators, we review initials because we have to do the initial weighting, and we review weighting changes. And occasionally we look at other ones for a variety of reasons. Someone asks us to or whatever. And sometimes when we get in and we're doing our weightings, we do tend to look at certain things. So one of the things that I've noticed, and that's kind of why we're talking about today, is the graph setup screen, the progress monitoring piece, and just the overall compliance with federal and state laws requiring the work that you do with these topics. So those are the things we're going to cover today. And again, if you have questions, put those in the chat box, and we will have time for you to just share out questions as well and have conversations. So one thing that we've learned over time is the pendulum has swung from complete pull-out to complete push-in with co-teaching to a more balanced approach, is that our learners have to have access to good quality core instruction. That's how they make progress in the general education curriculum, and that's how they close that achievement gap. So no matter what the level of disability, those children should be involved in making progress in that general ed curriculum. And if they're on alternate assessment, and Ron is our alternate assessment guru, and so he can answer more specific questions about that. But no matter what curriculum you're in, the idea of making substantial progress towards the expectations of students the same age or grade, and with the essential elements students on alternate assessment, again, making substantial progress towards the expectations there. And that's why we have goals. And we're monitoring progress is to make sure we're informed about a student's progress in the general curriculum. So I know you all know these things, but this is kind of the thought process that you go through in terms of looking at the goal page. You have a lot of data. You have a lot of data that you bring to the table for these kiddos. And so you know, based on that data, what those priority needs of the student should be. So you take a small piece of that data and you set the baseline. From that, you establish a challenging goal that hopefully can be achieved in a year. And then you establish what that progress monitoring is going to look like. And we'll talk about that. And the baseline really tells us that beginning level of performance. Before instruction or intervention begins related to that goal, this is where the student is. One of the things that we don't often see when we're looking at IEPs, and sometimes it's because it's not written that way, is that idea of a stable and representative baseline. When you only have one data point, let's say you do one comprehension test, or you do one oral reading fluency probe, or you do one behavioral checklist, that's one point of data in time. And that child could be having a bad day. You know, for whatever reason, that one data point in time may not be representative of the child's true ability, okay, at the time you're establishing baseline. So everything that I look at in terms of research and evidence-based practice is to try to get that a median of 3 different data points. Median means the middle. So a reliable baseline means it's stable and representative, and we'll look at an example here in a minute. But a stable and representative baseline is usually the median of 3 scores taken at 3 different times. Could be 3 different days. It could be 3 different times during the day. But that's where we want to start. We want to make sure that that information that we know about the child is the best that we can come up with for that kiddo. Also, one of the things that I see sometimes is that the baseline doesn't match the goal in the progress monitoring. And we'll see some examples of that, but there has to be alignment between the baseline, the goal, and the progress monitoring. And again, we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Also, the baseline data that you select is the starting point of the goal line on the graph. So when you get to the graph setup screen, that goal starting point is your baseline data point. And we'll see some examples of that in a minute. Lastly, a range is never acceptable as a baseline. I cannot graph a range. If you say they range from 100 to 200 or 60 to 70, I can't put both of those data points in as the baseline data point. So getting that median of 3 stable and representative data points is the best thing that you can do to create a reliable baseline starting point for the child. This just happens to be a screenshot out of the procedures manual.
Angie,
yeah, go ahead.
We're having a we're not seeing your slides move here. We're just seeing. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's frozen or let's try showing that again.
Yeah, I'll do that. That's interesting.
It somehow froze, and we were just seeing that initial screen.
Okay, what are you seeing now?
Now I think we're good. Now we're on the yes.
Okay, this one?
Yes, we're okay now.
Okay, all right, good deal, thanks. Technology is great when it works, right? So first of all, you see here, a baseline must include a number. And I can tell you all, like 99.9% of the time we do see a number. Occasionally we'll see a goal where it says, or a baseline where it says something like, the student is unable to count, or the student is unable to do something. And while that might, we might make an assumption that that means 0, we specifically have to have a number in that baseline statement. Again, the baseline's also the graph starting point, and the same measurement tool that you use to determine the baseline must also be the measurement tool used in progress monitoring. Okay, so a couple of the things to see, you see the example there about Maribel, and that comes directly from the procedures manual. And we'll talk about this in a minute with the goal, but you can see this example has several different components to it. It has the condition. So it has what we want her to be able to do. We want her to read. Let's see, I'm looking at my note here. It has a condition, I'm sorry, which is 4th grade materials. So she's got some 4th grade oral reading fluency probe. So that's the condition, and that's what we're also looking at in the goal. So we're matching the goal and the baseline up. We also see the behavior. She'll read and she'll decode. Those are the things, the skills that we want her to be able to do. And then the criterion would be 74 words per minute and 83% decoding accuracy. So our baseline and our goal are going to match up, and we'll see that here in a minute, with the condition, the behavior, and the criterion. Another thing that it's important for us to realize is that the behavior that we're talking about in the baseline and the goal needs to be kind of an observable skill. We want to see things like we'll read, we'll decode, we'll compute, we'll behave, we'll articulate, we'll move. We don't want to see things like score. Now, if the compliance police came out and pulled up your IEP and they saw Maryville will score 47 words per minute, I mean, the compliance police isn't going to do anything to you. But the goal needs to be about the skill and the behavior that the child needs to learn. And so if we can articulate that with our baseline and our goal, that's going to help parents and everyone understand what is it that we're really focusing on with this child and their goal. So just keep that in mind. Additionally, just make sure your IEP can pass the stranger test. If someone picks up your baseline and goal, are they going to understand what it says and what you're trying to measure? You'll see some examples here as we go along where we're just kind of scratching our head trying to figure out what they mean. All right, did my screen advance? Ron?
Yes,
Hello?
yes, it did. Yep.
Okay.
You're good.
So this is just an example of some baselines, and this is where you're beginning to look at your stable and reliable or representative data. So this is oral reading fluency data taken over 3 points in time. We have a 59 words per minute, a 72 words per minute, and a 47 words per minute. So would you say this data is stable? It's pretty varying, right? So is it truly representative of what the student can do? Probably not. So we would probably go ahead and assess a little bit more, maybe collect a couple more data points and see if we can get something that's more stable. So let's look at the different data set here. So for this student, we have scores of 40 words per minute, 44, and 37. Those are pretty stable, probably pretty representative of the child's skills. So if we took the median score for this student, we would say 40. That's the score in the middle. So for this particular child, we would say the student is reading 40 words per minute on their baseline. Again, if you don't have that stable and reliable data, you want to continue to test until you get something that is more representative. All right, any questions about baseline? Don't see anything on the chat. All right, lots to cover, so we'll keep it going. All right, the annual goal. So you've seen this in the procedures manual. It's just really a reminder about what needs to be included in the goal. The condition, the behavior, the criterion. And so the condition is when and how the student will perform. So something like when given a grade level CBM passage. Again, that behavior is what the student will do, and it's specific with an observable kind of skill or behavior. The student will read. And then the criterion is the acceptable level of performance, something like 85 words correct per minute with 98% accuracy. And we all know that the goal is usually meant, in most cases, to describe what we can reasonably expect the student to accomplish in that 12-month period with the special education services and supports that are being provided. Yeah. So I won't go into short-term objectives, but for those of you that are doing alternate assessment, you know that short-term objectives or major milestones are required for those students on an alternate assessment, and you can find more information on page 454 of the procedures manual if you have questions about that. So very, very quick description of the goal. We'll see some examples here in a few minutes, but it has that same kind of pattern as we see in the baseline. So for progress monitoring, progress monitoring procedures require that we talk about how progress will be measured and that would be the same way you collected your data for the baseline, how often progress will be measured or obtained, and the procedures manual talk about either once a week or every 2 weeks in general. Now, there are a few occasions where we might not see that, and that might be, let's say, an itinerant teacher for a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing that only sees the student maybe once or twice a week. There may not be the expectation or the need to be able to progress monitor that often. And we also know with ESSA, the requirements under federal law for education, it's the new No Child Left Behind, we have to monitor, at least at the elementary level, reading for children that are not scoring at proficiency weekly. So that law may dictate something different than what you would normally do, especially in the area of reading. But generally, how is going to be the same tool that you use to gather the baseline. How often will be once a week or twice a week. And the decision rule is also required. And that typically talks about either a trend line analysis, 7 to 10 points. Most people use a 4-point decision-making tool, decision rule, which means after 4 data points, if there are 4 consecutive data points above or below the aim line, you're going to look at the data and you're going to try to make some decisions about what you need to do. So that progress monitoring is really, if you termed it monitoring for progress, maybe it puts it in a little bit different perspective for you. But it is a very important tool that we use, or process that we use, to make sure that what we're doing for the kiddo is making a difference. We certainly don't want to go through a whole semester, a whole year, and not see progress and have wasted a whole year's worth of time. So we're looking at that data regularly, frequently, and repeatedly to make decisions about, do I need to do something different? And so, this is just a little bit more information about what I just said. Progress monitoring component of the goal page guides us how data will be collected. It establishes that decision-making plan, helps the provider making ongoing instructional decisions, and it can provide that summative evidence that allows that IEP team at that annual meeting to determine whether the student has achieved their goals. And we do recommend that you make a copy of that graph at the annual review and just share it with them. This is what we said we wanted to do last year. This is the progress that he made over the course of the year. We're good to go, but we've still got some challenges that we need to work on, and this is what we're going to work on next. Again, the effectiveness is the progress monitoring. There's some things that you want to make sure that you're doing. You want something that's quick and easy to implement. Really, the progress monitoring tool is like a dipstick. Let's say you're cooking a cake. You're baking a cake, and you want to know if it's done. Everybody takes a toothpick, and they tap it in the middle there. They pull it out, and they see if it's still gooey or if there's nothing on that toothpick, and that can tell us whether the cake is done or not. If it's not done, we stick the whole thing back in the oven. We don't get a baker's torch and we torch the middle to get that part done. We stick the whole cake back in the oven. And that's representative of our instruction. So we're baking the whole cake. We're teaching the whole child. So if there's a problem with reading, we may be working on some fluency things. We may be working on some decoding. We may be working on some vocabulary. We may have a nice comprehensive program, but our dipstick to see if it's working, to see if it's done, is that toothpick or that progress monitoring tool. So it has to be easy to implement. You have to be able to do it very frequently. It should only take a very short amount of time from instruction, 2-3 minutes. And also, I had a special note here that I wanted to make sure that I shared with you. It has to be sensitive enough to measure incremental changes in behavior. And I did want to stop and have a discussion about that. If you think of oral reading fluency probe and you're measuring correct words per minute, and you've been able to set an ambitious growth goal of 1.2 words per minute. So we started here, we're going to get to here, and we're using this formula to tell us that. we can see week after week, they might go from 42 words to 45 words to 39 words to 47 words. We're seeing those incremental changes in behavior. But what happens if you have a rubric that has 10 points or 5 points? I've even seen rubrics with 4 or 5 points. Talk to me about what that means in terms of trying to make decisions about progress for a child. So go ahead and jump in, and if you have a thought about the measure that you use and how it's important to measure those small changes in behavior so you can make good decisions about if what you're doing is effective. Any thoughts about that?
Can you be a little more specific, Angie? 5 points, what are?
Well, yeah, let's say, okay, so my first example was with oral reading fluency. And so let's say you're trying to go from 45 words per minute to, let's say, 90 words per minute. Okay, so each week you're doing your assessment with your oral reading fluency probe, and you're seeing a variety of data. And based on that data, you're able to connect your dots with that trend line that the graph creates. And you can see, gosh, this student is making some really nice progress. It looks like they're going to meet their goal because their data points are above the aim line, and we see growth from 40 to 45 to 50 to 55 to 60. So we really know that student's on target to grow, to meet their goal. But if you have a tool that you only have maybe 5 points, so week 1 you have, maybe your baseline is 1, and if you could mute your microphone, that would be great. Week 2 you might have 1 point. Week 3 you might have 1 point. Week 4 you might have 2 points. You see, you're not seeing those incremental changes in the behavior that you want to see to know that what you're doing is working. So the smaller the scale, if you will, of your progress monitoring, the less likely you're going to be able to make meaningful decisions about student progress. Because if you can only get a point of 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, you're not seeing the richness of the growth of that behavior over time. So I would caution you about using something that isn't sensitive to measure changes over time in a more effective way. And Ron, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or if you can articulate that a little differently. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I just think the biggest challenge is just sensitivity, to growth, enough points to span so that you can, see gradual changes over time. That's probably the biggest challenge. But no, I think, yeah.
So sensitivity, yeah.
So even when you have, sometimes there's rubric approaches and things like that can be good assessments, but it can be hard sometimes. I mean, if you only have a 5 or 6 or 7 point rubric, it's kind of hard to see small amounts of growth over time.
Mm-hmm. Does that help?
Yep, but I struggle with especially behaviors like in kindergarten, preschool, using rubrics and knowing, how many points to assign each behavior. Say there's 3 different behaviors we're working on. Mm-hmm. I struggle with that.
Well, possibly breaking down the behaviors even more. If you're talking about following directions, for example, which is a struggle with little preschoolers sometimes, what are some of those specific behaviors that you want to see the child do? If you're struggling with transition time, being, successful during transition time, what are some of those specific behaviors that you want to see the child do? And so as you begin to think about those specific behaviors, your rubric can contain quite a number of possible points, because following directions probably has about 5 or 6 different things that you want the child to be able to do. And it may not matter whether it's in an academic type setting or if it's a play-based setting, but there are certain things you know that if they're doing these 4 or 5 or 6 things, I know that they're going to be following directions, or these are the skills that they are missing out when they're doing this. So yeah, I agree that that can be challenging to think of, but just try to remember that sensitivity of your tool really helps you determine whether they're successful. If they're just getting a 1 point on, yes, they follow directions, do we really know that they understand how to follow directions? And if I see 1 point, you know, forever, what are we missing? What are we missing? So I think your Sped Rep can maybe help you with that, and you can maybe look online at some different opportunities or different examples of what might work. But that sensitivity to growth over time is what we're talking about, which is a characteristic of an effective progress monitoring tool. Really good question.
Thank you.
But I got a question for you. If you have 3 main goals that you're looking at, as far as if it's following directions or hallway behavior or anything like that, can't you tag that more frequently throughout the day instead of just doing it one time? So, you know, you could have those 3 pieces you're looking at, but let's say as a middle school, you're looking at 8 periods a day. Well, you've got 24 points in a day right there, that which you go 3 times 8.
You would have to be very structured about how you do that. So you would want to either section off your day into time periods,
Right.
or do it by class period.
Classes.
Or something.
Yep.
One day you wouldn't want to do it only twice, and the next day you do it 4 times, because
Right.
then you're being a little consistent about how you're collecting. But as long as you have a structured process to collect that, sure. I mean, you could add up your points over time. How many did they get per day or per week?
Which is also going to tell you what the bad times are of the day.
That's exactly right. Yep. And that's important to know, especially with behaviors. You know,
Right.
where are you seeing those challenges in your data? Exactly what you talked about can help show that. You
Yeah.
bet. So yeah, you can be creative with that. But just keep in mind the effective characteristics of effective progress monitoring is that your tool is sensitive. All right, great. Talked about this already. I'm going to talk about it again because I still see struggles in some of the IEPs that I review about this alignment. The baseline and the goal criterion must have the same numeric measure. If it's oral reading fluency in the baseline, it should be oral reading fluency in the goal. If it's Mays comprehension in the baseline, it's Mays comprehension in the goal. So that alignment and the evaluation procedure must correspond to that measurement. So again, however you collected your baseline data is what you use to collect your progress monitoring data. So here's an example of a good alignment. So we have a baseline, and it also has the, you know, the condition, the behavior, and the criterion too. So you can kind of see what that good, what the good baseline and goal should look like anyway. But so given a 5th grade reading passage, that's my condition. George reads the passage and answers comprehension questions. That's the behavior with 10% accuracy. That's the criterion. So the measurable goal in 36 weeks, when given a 5th grade reading passage, we have that condition. He'll read the passage and answer questions, and with 90% accuracy on 3 consecutive dates. And we don't often see that, and I don't know if there's any hard and fast rule to add that on 3 consecutive data collection dates. But I can tell you that I recently ran across an IEP and was having a conversation with a colleague about student data kind of being maybe hovering around the aim line, and then maybe not so much, kind of starting to go below the aim line. And then all of a sudden, there was a data point that was very, very high. The student had an IEP meeting, and I'll tell you, we didn't look at the IEP, you know, but all of a sudden that goal was ended, and on face value, it looks like, oh, had one really strong data point at the top, he's met the goal, we're going to exit. So it probably is a good idea to think about. We don't want to base our decisions on just one data point, but if the student can maintain that performance over time, then that's when we want to consider exiting that goal. And then another, piece of this in terms of good alignment, once a week. So that's our how often. George will be given a 5th grade reading passage to read and 10 comprehension questions to answer, and that's our how. And then the classroom teacher will collect the data and graph it, and if 4 consecutive data points fall above or below the aim line, instructional changes will be considered. So that's the good decision-making rule that we would want to see. So those are aligned really well. Now this one is not, and this is one that I found recently, and let's take a look at it. The baseline, his comprehension of text-related questions is scoring at or below a 3 on a 4-point scale. So what we talked about before is that's probably not a scale that's sensitive enough to measure change the way we would want it to. The annual measurable goal in 36 weeks, when scored on comprehension, Sam will score 85% or above on the employability rubric. So there's not alignment at all. The employability rubric was not mentioned in the baseline. And you can see the baseline has 3 on a 4-point scale, and the goal has 85%. So it looks like we're, comparing apples to oranges, and there's not alignment. And then if you look at the progress monitoring, course reading assignments, which utilize comprehension questions, trimester grades. I guess that's the how. I don't know, maybe the how often is trimester grades, but it really doesn't align with what we have above. And the 4-point decision-making rule will be used for changes. Well, I can't pick that up and that passed the stranger test. So you're seeing a good example of a good alignment and now an example of a problematic alignment. Do you have any questions about either one of those? And these are actual statements I took from IEPs. I know none of you on the Zoom today have problematic alignment with your goals. All right. So graphing, why do we put data on a graph? Why is it important? It helps quantify that improvement in a visual format. And actually, several years ago, the state said it's required. You have to show a visual representation of student progress. So we can see very easily with that graph what the student's progress is related to where we want them to be. Provides us good ability to make decisions regarding the effectiveness of our instruction, and it helps us predict learning rate. If you see an aim line or a trend line that's below the aim line, gosh, he's probably not going to reach his goal by the end of our goal period. We probably need to do something differently. And on the flip side, if the trend line is above the aim line, boy, they're probably going to meet their goal before the end of our goal time. We might have to modify that, make it a little more stringent, or we may have to craft a new goal if he's successful, the next few periods with this goal. And, our data is continually above that aim line and meets the goal. We may need to just go ahead and discontinue that and put a new goal in. So don't be afraid to do that. Our goals are usually written for a year, but there's nothing that says a kid can't meet it before that. And if they do meet it before it, we don't really want to keep on working on that. We'd like to work on the next level or the next skill that the student needs. So the graph setup screen and alignment, I see lots of trouble with this. It's getting better, but some people don't understand that the baseline data point from the goal page is the goal starting point on the graph setup screen. And the goal on the goal page is the goal ending point on the graph setup screen. And then the baseline data point should be entered in the first data, at the bottom of the data table with the date, and should be checked as baseline. And we'll look at some examples here. The National Center on Response to Intervention talks about the need to be engaged or have access to that instruction before you're really starting to make decisions on whether what you're doing is working or not. And so this is something that they recommend, even though you're collecting your data each week and you're using that 4-point decision-making rule, and so you have to look at it if 4 points are below or above the aim line. They do talk about if you've had at least 3 weeks of instruction and you have at least 6 data points, then you are more likely to be able to make a good decision about whether what you're doing is effective for this child. So keep that in mind. If you have 4 data points and it's the first 4 out the chute and they're not looking very well, what you might do is, if you're seeing a little bit of an upwards trend, say, you know, data review, no change. I've looked at this. I think we're going to make progress. We haven't really had enough instruction under our belt. We're going to keep watching it. And then we'll continue to look at the next few data points after. And if at that point in time you're not seeing the improvement that you want to see, you're probably going to want to do a phase change. So why is it important to have a decision-making rule? Again, it helps you determine whether what you're doing is supporting the needs of this kiddo. Again, as we talked about just a minute ago, if their trend line is not in the trajectory of their aim line, it's more, it doesn't project the student meeting their goal after 36 weeks or within 36 weeks, you want to make a change now. You don't want to wait and wait and wait and hope that something you're going to do works. You want to thoughtfully look at that data and make changes. So I've linked in here and you'll be able to see it, and I'll see if I can get into it. Are you seeing this intervention system, or are you still on the PowerPoint, Ron?
No, we're seeing it now. It went through fine.
Okay, so this is an intervention guide, and if you've heard about differentiated accountability, you've probably heard of the atomic flower. Let's see. You've probably heard of things like assessment database decision making. You've heard of things like the universal tier tools. You've heard of the intervention facilitation guide. Well, this particular document is the facilitation guide, and it's a part of differentiated accountability, and it also is going to be used in Iowa's model for ESSA. So if your school district happens to be comprehensive or targeted with that ESSA report card, this may be something that your district looks at. But this intensification guide is something that you could use as a resource to help you determine what might I want to do if the student's data isn't showing what we want it to show. So just looking at here, and I'm not going to go through this in any detail. You can look at it and then you could talk with your literacy consultant or school improvement consultant if you have questions. But things like the session frequency, if the student isn't making the progress that we want with the interventions that we have, let's say you're implementing this particular intervention called ABC Read 3 times a week. Well, you may need to do it 5 times a week. So you may need to be meeting more often than you were. You may have to increase the length of your session. You may need to go from 20 minutes to 30 minutes. You may have to reduce the number of children in your group. And I know those sound maybe easy, but difficult to implement. So this guide might help you think about some different things that you could do if you're faced with having to make an instructional change. So going back to the PowerPoint, are you seeing this, the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So these are some things that you'd want to consider when your data isn't showing improvement. Obviously, speaking with your SPED literacy consultant, your SPED rep, your speech pathologist, your SDI math consultant, those are all people that can help you kind of figure out, well, what do I do next?
Angie?
Oh, yeah.
That instructional intervention guide,
Mm-hmm.
that looks like something that maybe gen ed teachers could use for their interventions in their classroom.
You bet. When those were initially designed, they were more designed for, I mean, it's part of the multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI. Those were kind of what they were originally designed for, but they have great utility within special education. So you're welcome to share that link Starting in January, I think it's December or January, we'll be offering a series of trainings on universal tier tools, which is kind of out of this set. It's not this one. But next summer, we'll be offering within Green Hills AEA the intervention training. So, you know, if your district has decided that universal is not where we want to focus, but we want to focus on intervention in our MTSS process, then they'll be able to send a team of educators and principals to the intervention system training this summer. So the universal tier tools, the assessment database decision making, and the intervention guide, if you Google those with Iowa in the front, you should be able to find all of those, and we can probably link them all in the document here at a later time, but those are good resources for you to be able to use, and some of those are real good for special education. So, so let's look at some graphs. Okay, so luckily our system will tell us at the top in big red letters, which you don't see on here, that you need to make a decision about this child's performance. And so with this particular graph, you can see that there's about 7 data points above the aim line. So I'm just going to ask, what should be done based on what you know about this graph and this data? What would you do as a teacher? I could let the silence do the heavy lifting. Go ahead.
Increase his goal.
You might want to do that if he hasn't met his goal yet. I didn't extend the screenshot out to the goal ending point, but he hasn't met his goal yet. But his trend line showed that he's on trajectory to exceed that, actually. But what I would want to see is that you've reviewed this data and perhaps no change is needed. So we'd want to see, you know, you can go in and you can put a comment or you can do phase changes. We want to see data review no changed at a minimum. The student's making some nice progress. They haven't met their goal yet. We don't think that we need to make any change right now because we are seeing that improvement. So let's just stay the course and see what the next few data points shows us. Mid-year, you may see that he's just really, really exceeding that goal, and you might want to change to a next level of a text, or you might want to discontinue this one and start a new one. But at a very minimum, we'd want to see some kind of indication that you actually reviewed this data and you thoughtfully considered it, and you're not going to make any change at this time, or you are. So we don't want to see that many data points above or below the aim line without some kind of indication that you've reviewed it.
Okay. Wait, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. When would you use that under the phase line? Is it under the phase line? Decreased instructional time? I've never used that before. Would this be a case where you could?
Well, that's a good question, and I think we might get to that a little bit in our next session on fidelity. Mm-hmm. But let's just very quickly, because we don't have a ton of time left, but very quickly, let's say that you've been, well, in general, there's an intervention that you want to implement, and it has 5 components, all right? Mm-hmm. So you are very diligent and you are implementing all 5 components and you see evidence of this nature. So, wow, this intervention is designed is really working. I'm going to keep it up, okay? I'm going to keep up this 20 minutes or this 30 minute because it's really working. Okay, let's say teacher B implementing the same program, but only implements step 4 with about 50% of the time. Okay, so they're doing really good with steps 1, 2, 3, and steps 5, but they're only implementing step 5 about 50% of the time. And they get this kind of data. Wow, did he really need step 4 to be successful? Or I'm implementing step 1 through 5, you know, just all the time, good fidelity, and my data is below the aim line. So gosh, this isn't probably what he needs. And then the fourth kind of thing would be, I'm implementing everything but step 4, and he's not making the progress that I want to see. If that's the case, I can't make the case that my intervention is not working because I'm not implementing it fully. I'm not implementing it with fidelity. So if you have good evidence that you're implementing with fidelity, they're making really good growth, and you think, well, gosh, he probably doesn't need this much time. Maybe it's for behavior, maybe it's for reading, maybe it's for whatever. I think your IEP team could decide that we're going to reduce that, but I would never reduce your time without an IEP meeting. Because if you say you're going to work with that kiddo 30 minutes and you all of a sudden say, I'm just going to do it for 15, that's going to get you into trouble. Mm-hmm. So I think your team having a really good discussion about the strategies that you've been using, the success that the child has been making, can help determine if a decrease in instructional time is needed. Because maybe more time is needed for math since they're making such good progress. So I think it's a thoughtful discussion with your IEP team based on your data and the strategies that you're using.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't see that being used very often, do we? All right, so here's another example of a graph that I found. We can see at the first part of the year, there was a data reviewed, no change. The data was all above the aim line. But now if we project out and we've got some more data points, and first of all, we notice that our trend line is now below our aim line, and the student does not appear to be at trajectory for meeting their goal. And now they've got 4 data points below the aim line. And I realize summer happened, but if summer hadn't have happened, we would have expected to see some kind of indication that the data was being looked at. And in this case, where you kind of started out strong, but really have kind of plateaued, you're probably going to want to think about doing something a little bit, maybe intensifying instruction, adding some time, doing something, because this child is now not predicted to make the goal at the end of the goal period. And then this is one where we see kind of the data hovering around the aim line a lot. There was a period of time where it was above, and we do see that the teacher was diligent about looking at the data and saying, no, I don't think we need to make any changes right now. We can see that the trend line is above the aim line, and everything being equal, we would expect this child to meet the goal even before the goal period was over. So the data reviewed no change appears to be very appropriate for this kiddo because they are making some nice progress. They've dipped a little bit towards the end, so we're going to keep plugging along, and hopefully we'll see that data continue to go up, but we're going to keep checking it and make sure we're making appropriate decisions for this kiddo. All right, so here's our graph setup screen. And so this example I'm going to carry through for a few slides. So this young person is doing oral reading fluency and is reading 58 correct words per minute for a baseline. And the goal for this child is 90 correct words per minute. And those are the exact numbers that I found on in the baseline and goal area of the goal page. So yay, got it right. So then this is the table at the bottom where you're entering, your data points over time, and you can see that we've got the baseline data point checked over in the right. It has that blue check mark. We've got, ooh, it is wrong. Dang it. Nope, I'm sorry. Sorry. I was looking at the 90 and the 92. That's the accuracy. So we've got the 58, which is the baseline data point. So this is set up right, and we're ready to go. And you can see, boy, this person's really been collecting the data. They've collected it, every week as described in the decision-making rule. So then we get to the goal, or the graph page, and we see 58 is the baseline point, and that's the point where the aim line starts. 90 is where the aim line ends, and we've got our nice little data points along there. So the only thing that I would say in this particular case is back in the spring, the student was not making the progress that we'd wanted. Would you do a phase change in May, early to late May? Maybe not, but certainly you know, when the students started back in the fall, there was a change made, and now we're seeing, you know, kind of an upwards trend there. We don't have enough data in the system for it to draw a trend line for us, but so kind of through and through, this example was pretty good. A little iffy on the phase change at the end of the year, but there probably wasn't time to do a lot of different. So again, the IEP police are probably not going to come knocking on his door. So let's look at another example. So this is an example I took from one of our districts. And so why don't you just take about 1.5 to 2 minutes to read that. All right, so what do you think?
Baseline needs to be more specific instead of that range of 800 to 900.
Right, range of 800 to 900. We've already talked about you can't graph a range. We shouldn't see that. Okay. What about in the goal? Anything with that? Same thing?
It needs to not have that at least 70%. It should give a specific percentage.
Right. What about the progress monitoring?
Pretty vague and doesn't tell how often.
It doesn't necessarily say how or how often. And in many cases, not many cases, in some cases, people forget to attach the rubrics or matrix. And so we don't know what that means anyway. So a little vague, a little problematic. We don't do ranges. We don't do at least. We need more specific information. So let's look at the graph. Let me just ask you, if you saw this, and let's say the Lexile level just said 800 and in the baseline and 1,000 in the goal, all right? I would kind of expect to see the Lexile levels graphed, wouldn't you? This is the graph setup screen. So they chose to do the percentage. And so the parent, and I think Ron will talk a little bit more about this next time with the NDRU implications. So my child starting at 70% and you want him to end at 70%? I'm not sure that's really what they meant to measure, but that's what was being measured instead of the Lexile. And so here's the graph. What decisions can we make about this child? Do we know if the Lexile range has increased? Has he gone from 800 to 900? We have no idea. What thoughts do you have about this? It's just problematic, and I guess what I would have hoped to have seen would be the Lexile, because I can see that the student is growing. This I have no idea, you know, as I said, has he moved from 800 to 900? Is he down to 700 but still doing 70%? We just don't know. So this one is a problematic example kind of from start to finish. Here's another example of an incorrect goal statement and so forth. Writing simple sentences at 85% when given a topic, but struggles with fluency and ideas, that's at 20%. So when given a writing assignment, she'll write at least 3 sentences with fluency. So 50% is what we're going to see. Instructional changes will be considered when progress is plateaued or regressed. Data points every 2 weeks. So I might be confused a little bit about what I'm going to see on the graph setup screen because I've got an 85%, I've got a 20%. And also the progress monitoring does not talk about how progress is going to be measured. So let's take a look at the screen. Keep in mind 80, 85 and 20 and then 50. So on our graph setup screen, we've got 0 for a goal starting point, which I think they probably meant to do 20. So our graph is going to be wrong because our goal starting point is incorrect. And note the date of the start of this IEP is 3/20. Now that may not mean, you know, the same date that you collected your data, but it should be close. So our first data point on this graph is 4/6. It's not 0. It should be 20. It's not 0 like it said it was. And the baseline is not checked. So this graph was set up incorrectly. And this is the data that we see. So what I did is I went in and I fixed the graph so it was correct. And in this particular case, it didn't make a lot of difference, but I have seen graphs where it has. From kids that look like they're achieving way beyond their goal, and then when you set up the graph correctly, their data is hovering around the aim line or even below. So it is important. I'll go back. So this is what it looked like before. Looks like they're performing quite well, way above expectancy, and now it's, you know, just a little bit. So it is important to make sure your graph is set up correctly so you can make appropriate decisions about the data. This is an example that I found a couple of days ago. And who can tell me what's wrong with this? Somebody new, jump in.
No baseline is checked.
No baseline is checked. What else? Remember, this was from a couple of days ago.
Where's this year?
Exactly. Yes, so from a compliance standpoint, this is a significant issue. You know, when we say we're going to collect the data, you know, once a week, we expect to see that data in there on a very regular basis. You know, it may be the following week that you get it in there, but you're going to get it in on a timely manner, because if it's not in there, you can't make decisions about how well the instructional practices that you're engaging in with the student are working. So we have no idea how this child is performing this year and if what's going on is working. I can tell you that several years ago, I had a case where, and this was a case where we'd had attorneys involved in the past. And so a new teacher had this kid, and his reevaluation was coming up in November. And I pulled up the graph, and there was no, there was no data in there for the whole semester so far. And so I talked to the teacher, and unfortunately I made her cry, and that certainly was not my intent, but I think she was frustrated. And her response to me was, well, I didn't know what the other teacher was using. And I'm thinking in my head, well, that other teacher is down the hallway. If you're confused about that, go hunt them down until they, you know, until they tell you. Generally, the goal is clear enough to know what's being used, but if it's not, you need to go find that person. And if you can't replicate what you're doing, then, you know, you may need to do a phase change, you may need to recraft the goal or whatever with the team's decision, but make sure you're putting your data in there on a regular and frequent basis so you can make decisions about it, because this would not pass compliance. And, you know, if a parent had a complaint, the district would not have a leg to stand on. Now, maybe he's collected it or she's collected it, but it's just not in here. And we can't make decisions with a bunch of pieces of paper that have numbers on them because they don't make sense to us in that format. So real quickly, I'm not going to go through these others. You can see a couple of other examples, but I will show you that this screenshot at the top is from the BOEE, which is the Bureau of Educational Examiners for the state of Iowa. And they are getting more and more complaints against special education teachers for progress monitoring problems, either not doing it or falsifying data. Okay, so this one entered incorrect progress monitoring data. I've seen several where they falsified data. And generally what happens is a parent calls to complain, or if the AEA and then the district cite this for a teacher, the district is required to report it to the BOEE. So it can come in on a number of different ways. But after the case has been resolved, it is reported in this BOEE newsletter. So this just happens to be one that was reported last spring, I believe. If you click on this link, it's going to go, and I did not, mark out this person's name, because if you clicked on this, if you went to the BOE newsletter, you'd be able to click on any of the cases and find out. This is just an example I picked up. But you will see that there is a case, and you can read about what happened, where she's from, what happened, what the settlement agreement is, and so forth. So you can read all about what happened. And then the bottom screenshot where you just see her last name and the final order of reprimand, that's actually on the BOEE website. So when I searched for her name on the BOEE website, this is what showed up. So I'm just telling you that these kinds of things are very important. Get your data in there, make sure it's accurate, make sure you're looking at it and you're making decisions based on what you see about your instructional changes. Because it could come back to haunt you with the BOEE.
Hey, Angie, there is a question
Yes.
in chat.
Okay.
And the question is, how do we document when student absences, not necessarily extended, consecutive days, are affecting the ability to progress monitor in a timely fashion, or their attendance is affecting the progress that is not being made?
Okay. Well, and Ron, jump in too, because I see that. I do see that on occasion where extended student absences. And I guess what I've recommended to the teachers that I work with that have that problem is to just make sure there's a comment in your, on your, where you enter your data, just make sure there's comments. If a student is gone a day, and that's the day you normally do your progress monitoring, try to catch them the next day or the next day. I mean, try to get that done. But if they're gone for extended periods of time, you can use that extended student absence. Or when you're talking with the parents, and maybe you call an IEP meeting and say, hey, he's been gone, we're not making the progress. Let's talk about something different. So you could potentially see a phase change in there, or a comment that he's been absent. We haven't either been able to provide instruction, or we haven't been able to do our assessments. And so I think that you just you have to have a conversation about that with parents. It's important that he's here for this purpose, because when he's here we can instruct him, and when he's not, we're not making the type of progress that we want to see. And so just documenting that as best you can. We just want to be as transparent with families as we can. And so if it's somewhere documented in the IEP, I think you'll be fine. Ron, would you have any other guidance?
No, I mean, I agree with what you said. I mean, that in the progress monitoring log, I mean, there is that opportunity to record comments in there, and I do see teachers sometimes doing that, regarding absences, that are impacting, or even, I've even seen, notes about refusals to participate and things like that. And so that's one way you can record that. Or just other documentation that you might keep. But
right.
But yeah, it's but if they're missing a day and it happens to be progress monitoring day, I mean, the best advice would be just, as Angie said, try to catch up, even though that that does, I mean, that can get complicated with scheduling and so forth. But trying to catch a student on a different day. Right.
I know I don't need to tell any of you this, because you guys are smart cookies, but don't make the data up. Parent comes to you. I actually had a situation several years ago where there was no data basically in the child's IEP. And so the parent happened to be the parent or the wife of a school board member for that school. So it was a little touchy situation. But the parent went in, the mom went in and talked to the teacher, and the teacher was able to produce 3 probes. One had the student's name on it, one did not, and I can't remember about the third one. So teacher or the parent physically went in to talk to the teacher. The teacher was able to open up a file and pull out these 3 probes with some data on it. The next day, miraculously, there was data for every week, for the past like 2 to 3 months, every week. And so, not surprisingly, the mother calls me and says, what's up? And so doing my due diligence, I was able to go, I don't know if you know this or not, but, and this was a couple of days later, but I was able to get a hold of the people in the bunker, that they call it, over in, I think it's Grantwood AEA, that houses the web IEP system, and tell her, can you print me off a copy or email me a copy of this child's IEP on this date and on this date? And actually, I think it was about 3 dates. And we could actually see when she went in and made the changes in the IEP. And so, we were able to take that information, and mom was able to look at this, and she's like, my son wasn't at school that day. There was no school this day. She was able to look at, the data that was in there and verify that the teacher was making it up. And so it was a big deal. So don't make up the data. If for some reason you didn't get it done, just fess up and do better the next time. But just be careful, because there's more and more complaints being filed against folks for falsification and not doing the progress monitoring the way they need to. A couple of examples. Another comment? What do you do when you have a behavior student with a math goal and refuse to mark an answer on his math probe? Oh, we get that too. Well, first thing, if they don't do the test, don't put a 0 in. I've seen that occur. Student refused, I'm going to put a 0 in. Well, that's not their actual performance, so don't do that. I guess I would try again maybe the next day. Put a notation in the logs that the student has refused to complete the progress monitoring. And if you begin to see a pattern of that, I think you call the team together, or you talk with your consultant, your principal, or whatever, to see if you can find out why and what you might be able to do differently. But we do have that happen, and I think, again, just being honest within your notes, what's happening, that's the best thing that you can do, and then trying to figure out the why, and if there's a way that you can, support getting that done. Ron, any other thoughts? I know we're about out of time.
Yep, similar thoughts. And I mean, if it's a chronic problem, if there's a student who's just flat out refusing to do work, refusing to do progress monitoring probes, I mean, that probably is a job for the IEP team to talk about. Do we need to put together a different behavior intervention plan to help things get back on track? So, I mean, but that's different from maybe an occasional refusal on a bad day type of a thing, where, like Angie said, it might just be catching up on a better day. So.
Yeah.
Can you actually do that though? I can't test it without getting into my web IEP right now, but I'm not sure you can put in a date and just a note. I think when you try to submit it, it pops up with a box that says you have to put a score in there.
That may be something that I've heard as well. Ron and I don't work very closely with the actual system and putting the data in there. So sometimes those little things we don't catch. How about if we check on that and get back to you?
But that would be nice if in the future you could actually date it and put a comment in there, because I'll find myself, let's just pretend that I'm over a week late in progress monitoring. I can't put anything in on the date when I was supposed to do it that the student was absent. I have to, on the date when I actually was able to, then make a comment that says something like, monitoring was delayed due to student absence or something like that.
Mhm.
It would be great if we could change that in the system.
Yeah, well,
So,
you know, they'll be developing a new one here soon, so. How about Ron and I check on that one and we'll get back with you all. We can probably put the answer in our Google Doc.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, I know I did just a ton of talking. I hope that you found some of it of value. And you'll kind of look through some of those examples and reflect on your practice. These are, again, the things that I find problematic in the IEPs. When I find problems, these are the things that I worry about and think about. So I just wanted to share those with you, and hopefully, you know, it was helpful information for you. So thank you all for joining us today. Ron, any parting comments?
No, I think we're good. We'll I'll go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll get this video posted up on our page, and that way, if you have any colleagues that had to miss today, they can catch up with that, and we'll go
All
from there.
right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks.